Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show. The Brexit negotiations are reaching a serious crunch. All of the leaders, the prime ministers and presidents of Europe, will get together in Brussels on the 14th and 15th of December. It is at that meeting that the British government had hoped to move on to some serious talks about what our trade relationship with the European Union will be once we've left. But there's a problem, and that is that all the European leaders, and I'm talking about Monsieur Barnier, Verhofstadt, Juncker, and indeed Donald Tusk, all of them are now as one. And they've given us an ultimatum. They've told us that unless by the end of this month we have satisfied their demands, in particular on the future of the border between Northern and Southern Ireland, and on the so-called Brexit divorce bill, where it appears they want us to pay 60 billion euros, unless those demands are met, they will have to tell, with regret, they say, the leaders in Brussels that insufficient progress has been made and that we cannot move on to discussing trade, which would mean that the next time all the leaders get together would not be until March in 2018, by which time the Article 50 process is beginning to disappear. We're running out of time. So it is a very, very big moment. What is the government going to do? How are they going to respond? And to try and help me through this, somebody that's been watching these European negotiations for many a year is Adam Bolton, editor-at-large for Sky News and commentator for the Sunday Times. Adam, good morning.
Good morning, Nigel.
Well, you've seen all of this, Adam, from the Maastricht Treaty onwards and various crises. How does this rate in terms of seriousness?
Well, it's obviously very serious because this is the most dramatic change in Britain's position vis-à-vis Europe since the 1970s. So there's serious talk on both sides. My feeling about the negotiations is that we know how Europe does business. I mean, you know very well from all the time you spent at Strasbourg and Brussels that things do tend to go down to the line, and that however carefully the backroom boys, if you like, prepare the negotiations, in the end it comes down to a head-to-head between the leaders, particularly the big leaders of Germany, France, Italy, Britain, and the rest. So I think there's a certain amount of theatre in all of this. This is the moment for the European Union to try and stand up for their interests in the process of Brexit. Obviously, that relates to the money. It relates to the what they call citizens' rights, EU citizens in this country and UK citizens in the EU. And it relates to this really existential question for Ireland, what the border is going to look like. So I think they're going to put the squeeze on as much as they can. But realistically, they know that Britain is on course to leave the European Union in 18 months' time. And so I think they will agree that they've got to have some sort of framework for what things are going to look afterwards when we come towards the end of the year. There may be a few weeks' delay and a bit of drama, but I think they know they've got to start talking about this in the round fairly soon.
I mean, I'm assuming that they're not bluffing. I mean, they're basically saying that unless by the 1st of December we're satisfied with the progress you've made, we can't recommend that European Council even discusses the issue of trade. And I just wonder, in Westminster, within our own party, if Mrs May was to say, OK, we agree, it's 60 billion euros, how does that go down with their own backbenchers?
Well, they know that, and they know on both sides that that's extremely sensitive. Now, effectively, one interpretation of the speech she gave in Florence would actually be that Britain is going to pay what it owes, and one version of it would be about 60 billion. I think if it emerges this week in hard figures, 60 billion, that would be a disaster because Eurosceptics would have to protest at that, bearing in mind that Boris Johnson talked about not a penny and listening for anything more than 10 billion. But if it just comes down to Britain has agreed that it will pay its obligations, that will probably be enough if there has been a nod and a wink behind. I mean, strangely, I think the biggest problem is this Irish question. I think it's absolutely massive. I think it got sidelined because, relatively to the rest of Europe, obviously Ireland is a small country, but I think it's a very dramatic issue, and for the Irish government, it is absolutely existential what their relationship is with the north of Ireland, bearing in mind all the history of the Troubles which we know about.
Yeah, but I mean, we have had a common travel area with Ireland since 1921, so I don't think the movement of people back and forth really is the problem. But I do see there's a point about goods if we're leaving the customs union and there isn't a free trade agreement. I mean, surely shouldn't the Irish government be arguing strongly to have a free trade non-tariff deal to keep that border as free as possible?
Yeah, and I think they would like that. I mean, obviously the Irish government would like Britain to stay in the European Union, which would involve having, as you say, a free trade area and freedom of movement. The problem is that there need to be, if Britain is going to be outside the EU and Ireland's going to be in it, there obviously has to be some sort of border control, and that clearly would affect the free movement of people and the travel area, whether people like it or not. And I think one of the issues the British government is only just coming to realise is whether it might have to agree some sort of special status within the island of Ireland.
Which could easily be negotiated, couldn't it? I mean, the one thing I get, Adam, is from the unionist community in the north. I mean, no one there is urging for there to be a hard border. There is general agreement that we have to try and make this as relaxed a border as we possibly can.
Yeah, but if the consequence of that is that effectively there's a border in the Irish Sea between the island of Great Britain and the island of Ireland, I don't think that will be acceptable to unionists, particularly, as we know, Nigel, now that the government is reliant on their votes to survive in the House of Commons.
Yes, now, I don't think the Ulster Unionist movement in the shape of the DUP has ever been in a more powerful position. I certainly agree with that. Adam, give me a prediction. Do you think that when Mrs May turns up in Brussels on the afternoon of the 14th of December to meet all the other leaders, do you think trade would be discussed?
I don't think it will be explicitly discussed at that summit. I think the best that they'll get for the summit is an agreement to start early in the new year, talking about negotiations in the round. But, as has been pointed out throughout these talks, it is not in the interest of either side in trade terms to have a hard Brexit. And therefore, I think, there is some concern that people do business is very, very concerned on both sides of the channel about their planning for the future and what they need to set to one side. So my guess is they won't talk about trade, certainly at that summit, and I think there may have to be further summits on that. But, what we're really talking about is can they move towards that deadline, which is frankly a year's time, of having a draft agreement, as you know, that they can then put to national and regional parliaments.
Yeah.
And things are really ticking away. But I think, bear in mind these people are politicians, and to fail in negotiations is really a total admission of failure of the political process.
Adam, I will see you at that summit in Brussels on the 14th of December. And thank you very much indeed for joining me here on LBC this Sunday morning. Well, Adam Bolton, kind of saying, however dramatic it looks on the big picture, quietly through the back channels, negotiations do take place. And even if it appears at that summit trade's not being discussed, somehow behind the scenes it will be, I still can't get away from the feeling myself that the demands that are being made by these unelected people in Brussels, I almost said nobodies, that wouldn't have been kind, would it? The demands that are being made are frankly wholly unreasonable, and I think if Theresa May was to agree to pay 60 billion euros as our parting shot from the European Union, I don't think the Conservative grassroots in this country would put up with it, and frankly, nor should they, in my view. Matthew in Heathrow is our first caller of the morning. So, Matthew, the government is in a bit of a pickle. What do you think Theresa May should do in the next fortnight?
Well, basically, I think, morning, Nigel, we just got to tell them what they want to hear, because we do want to get onto those trade talks. So basically, if we've got to offer more money, we offer more money. But basically, it's all subject to the final deal. So it's likely, once we get onto the trade deal, if they're not going to give us that free trade, we're going to walk away. But the main issue is the Northern Ireland issue, and unfortunately, the Conservatives have a conflict of interest. We've now got to get Northern Ireland, all the parties, to be talking together, and I think Jeremy Corbyn now has to go through the back door and actually get them together talking, because it's not going to be resolved until we get the people in the parties in Northern Ireland to be resolving it themselves between Southern Ireland.
I get the feeling, Matthew, genuinely, that the people that are causing the most problem with the Irish border issue are the European Commission themselves. They're the ones that are constantly talking up this difficulty, and whenever I speak to people in the north or the south, they're all for a sensible, pragmatic step forward. So Ireland may be a huge issue, and you know, indeed Adam Bolton, Matthew, thought the same. But just coming back to this money point, Matthew, you know, they're asking us to commit to, I think at current exchange rates, 53 billion sterling. And in return for which, they're guaranteeing us nothing but that we'll be able to talk about trade. I mean, it's almost like a ransom demand, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I understand. I mean, the way I see it, as long as it's the whole deal, so as long as we could sort of say, yeah, we will pay that, and possibly then we'll keep free trade for 5-10 years if we have to pay in so much money at the end of it once we get onto the trade. But we need to get that free trade, and you know, and obviously they do need money, and they do need our support for a while.
Oh, they need money, all right. They certainly need money, all right. They've got plenty of money problems. Matthew, thank you. Matthew thinks that actually getting towards free trade, even if it costs a great deal of money, is where we need to be. I find this figure of 60 billion euros wholly unreasonable. It's been plucked out of the air. I don't think there's any situation in which we should be paying anything like that to them. That's my view. Now, in a minute, there's a head-to-head debate between Alistair Campbell and myself. I can't think of two people in this country with more polarised, opposite opinions. You'll enjoy it. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show. Earlier on, I spoke to Alistair Campbell this morning, who is editor-at-large for the New European, and I started by asking him what Donald Tusk's ultimatum means to him.
Well, first of all, Nigel, before we go on, I think I need to take you up on something you tweeted about me yesterday.
Well, yeah, no, I'm very happy to do so.
You called me a traitor.
No, I didn't use the word traitor. I tell you, well, let's get the context. I didn't even use that word, but let's get the context of this right, shall we? We have a government that was elected on a Brexit manifesto. Indeed, the Labour Party, the opposition, were also elected in June on a Brexit manifesto, and all of this following a referendum. So, like it or not, to me, the settled will of the country is that the government pushes ahead with Brexit and does the best job for the country that it can.
Right. But the first, two things to say on that. The first is, Theresa May did not get a majority for the hard Brexit policy that she put to the people. The second thing is that millions of people, like me, voted Labour as, in our view, the best way to stop her getting that majority. So it's more complicated. You cannot say that 8 out of 10 people voted for Brexit because they voted Tory or Labour. And the other thing I would say is that democracy did not stop on June the 24th. And as we see the absolute chaos and incompetence at the heart of these negotiations, I think people are allowed to think again. They're certainly allowed, in my case, where I haven't changed my views since June the 23rd, to point out, as I did, that when the Irish Prime Minister says that this government has not thought things through, he is entitled to say that, and I'm entitled to say, who's somebody who passionately believes in maintaining the progress made in the Good Friday Agreement, that this government hasn't even thought through the question of the border in Ireland.
Well, let's get.
I was making, and I just think
fine, but Alistair, why did you vote? Why did you vote Labour? Why did you vote for what you consider to be hard Brexit? Because I listened to that Labour manifesto launch. In fact, I said on LBC how impressed I was by the things that Corbyn had said, because in that manifesto was very clear, was leaving the European Union, leaving the single market, and ending the free movement of people. That is what every Labour MP was elected on. And all I'm arguing is the settled will of the country is we should push ahead to Brexit. And as for the Irish,
it's not settled.
Well, why did you vote for what you call hard Brexit in the general election?
I am a Labour person all my life. The election, as Jeremy Corbyn, I mean, the one thing that I'd say Jeremy Corbyn did very, very well is, even though Brexit is the defining issue of our times, he managed to persuade people it was actually about jobs and health and education. I voted Labour because I felt that was the best way to stop Theresa May getting the landslide that she planned for the hard Brexit. So you cannot say she has a mandate for the policy that she put forward. I would say a hung parliament means, particularly with the DUP as propping up the government and the impact that has on the Northern Ireland peace process, you cannot say that the will of the people is settled. I have never known the country more divided, more angry, more determined, more feeling that the leadership in our country is absolutely woeful.
Well, I wouldn't disagree. I wouldn't necessarily disagree with you on that point, but
that means, Nigel, we cannot just go along with what Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, David Davis, Liam Fox tell us is the settled will of the people. It is not. And so I am going to keep arguing to stop this madness, because I think it's going to fundamentally damage our country.
Now, I know you take that view, and I know you believe that, and I take, of course, the opposite view. But, Alistair, the reason that we had our Twitter spat was that you were encouraging a foreign government in these negotiations to, and I quote you, play hardball. Now, surely, whether you like Brexit or not, you should be on our side, not their side.
But listen, this is, when it comes to Ireland, having spent a very, very decent part of my life working with Tony Blair and others to get the Good Friday Agreement in place, I actually don't see this as being us against the Irish. I see this as Brexit potentially destroying one of the most important progresses that we made. And to this day, 18 months in, I have not heard a single thing from a single government minister explaining how they are going to deliver Brexit across the island of Ireland without bringing back some sort of hard border.
Well, let me tell you, Alistair. Well, let me tell you how easy this is. The first thing is, we don't need lectures from Brussels on how to deal with the free movement of people with Ireland. We've had a common travel area since 1921. So
that's because we've been in and out together.
So that ends that.
No, it doesn't, Nigel.
When it comes to...
I'm sorry, Nigel, I'm not letting you get away with that. I'm not letting you get away with that.
And they're not part of Schengen.
Because we've been in and out together. This is going to be us out, them in, and we will be the only land border. Now, that is a problem. It is a real problem, which I'm afraid you and Johnson and all the rest of you, you just will away. You don't actually think through the detail.
But we don't need a hard border if we have a free trade agreement with the Republic of Ireland. And that's the argument. And my goodness me, I've had Irish farmers contacting me, very worried about the stance their own government in Dublin is taking. If we have the free movement of goods between the north and the south, we don't need a hard border. But, let's see where we get to on that. But can I bring you back to the fact that we're now in a position where, as I say, the hierarchy in Brussels have given us an ultimatum, effectively, that we have to offer them a gargantuan sum of money, or they will not, at the summit on the 14th and 15th of December, discuss trade with us. What should we do, in your opinion?
Well, I think the government is in a complete mess, I believe, of its own making. I've been involved in lots of these European negotiations down the years, and I actually think that the Europeans have been perfectly reasonable in the way that they've tried to take this forward. I think they were right to say that the so-called divorce bill is important, right to say that the Northern Ireland border is important, and right to say that the issue of EU citizens living here and UK citizens living in the rest of the EU. So I think they picked the right issues, and it exposes how ill thought through this whole project is, and how how little planning the British government did and has done since, that we are still so far away from meeting those. And the other thing I would say about the divorce bill settlement, these are gargantuan sums, as you say.
Yeah.
But they are as nothing compared to the sorts of sums that we're going to see drained out of the British economy if we leave the single market.
But I heard that argument if we didn't join the euro. I was told by your guys in 2000, if we don't join the euro, foreign and direct investment will drain out of the country. And look, we've got economists like Patrick Minford saying we could be 130 billion better off over the next decade.
Listen, you've got your token economist, you've got your token businessman with James Dyson.
And and Tim Martin and many, many others.
Nigel, I know that you're a politician and you're used to hearing the sound of your own voice, but you're now a radio host. Can you allow your guests to speak?
I think we're doing plenty of that, Alistair. But I mean,
Good.
whatever the economic future, Alistair.
Let me finish the point. Let me finish the
Tell
point.
me how 60 billion is justified.
Let me finish the point. Nigel, can you just hold your horses 1 second? Let me finish the point. Are you seriously saying, because you can quote Patrick Minford, that the balance... I know that you people hate experts because Michael Gove said we shouldn't respect them anymore. Are you saying that the balance of economic and business opinion is in favour of Brexit and saying that Brexit will boost the British economy? Because 99% of the ones that I speak to say the exact opposite.
The situation is the big corporates all go with the establishment, all go with the European Union. When you get to entrepreneurs and small and medium-sized businesses, you find a completely different answer to that question.
I do a thing. Let me say something, Nigel. Every single event I do, whether it's a school or a college or a university or a business convention or the Association of Colleges that I did this week or a health service conference I did the week before, I now start by asking 4 questions. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about Trump? Is 90% to 100% pessimistic. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about Brexit? I've yet to get an audience with more than 15% optimistic about Brexit. And do you think Theresa May will be there at the next election? Next to none. And do you think Jeremy Corbyn will be Prime Minister? It's about 10%. We have got a crisis of leadership in this country, and we are facing the biggest challenge we've faced since the Second World War, and we're doing it as you're interviewing, your questions are showing to me again today on the basis of wishful thinking and sort of raking up arguments from the past. Every balanced opinion, expert opinion on the economy and on business is terrified of what's happening.
And yet 70%, and yet 70% in the opinion polls, 70% consistently now want the government to press on with Brexit. Alistair, I'm going to ask...
Partly because you've got both main parties saying there's no alternative. Lord Kerr, in my view, showed last week you can stop this process if the country changes its mind, and with proper leadership, I am absolutely convinced the country actually is changing its mind without leadership. With leadership, I've got no doubt whatsoever people will want at least to think again, because this is a catastrophe in the making. And you, Nigel, are partly responsible for it. I know you're very proud of that, but I think history has done you very
No. I believe we should govern our own country, but I want these negotiations to be a success. It looks to me, although it's going to be very difficult, Mrs May is being asked to stump up 60 billion euros within the next fortnight for the conversation to even continue, should she say yes to their financial demands.
Well, she's in a negotiation, and these negotiations are like jigsaw puzzles in a way. There's all sorts of different moving pieces. But I repeat the point I made. Because of the woeful way that the debate is conducted in this country, because of the woeful way they've managed the negotiations, what should have been something that they should have been able to sort out fairly early in these negotiations has now become a massive thing. I repeat the point I made. If this leads to no deal, if this leads to us crashing out into the WTO, we are talking about damage to our economy that runs way, way beyond any sum that's being discussed now. So she needs to start getting a grip of it. And the reason why she can't, Nigel, the reason why they are in such trouble, I've never seen a negotiation of any government, frankly, including coalition governments that operate in the rest of the European Union, that is so divided, so briefing against each other, so not a team. It
must remind you of the good old days of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown.
At least we had the divisions, but we got an awful lot done.
Okay, Alistair Campbell, this one will run and run, and thank you for coming on this morning.
All the best.
Well, that was Alistair Campbell, the voice of Remain. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show. The EU bosses have given Theresa May an ultimatum. She has a fortnight to solve the Irish border issue and to cough up the cash. Otherwise, when all the European leaders meet on the 14th and 15th of December, we won't be able to talk about trade. So it's a pretty serious situation, and I'm asking you, do you think David Davis and his team will meet that December deadline? Let me know what you think by calling 0345 60 60 973. You can text to 84850. You can tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC. And, of course, you can watch the show live on Facebook and comment there too. Well, I'm guessing that the only way that we can satisfy the demands that we're getting from Mr Tusk and others is to meet their demands. But they're not being very nice about it, are they? I mean, Donald Tusk, former Polish Prime Minister, President of the European Council, in response to David Davis saying that we've compromised, which we did after the Florence speech from Theresa May, David Davis saying it's now the EU's turn to compromise. And Tusk replied, I really appreciate Mr Davis's English sense of humour. I mean, they're not even being nice about it. I'm guessing what we saw from the Prime Minister in Florence is that we are prepared to pay some vast bill to leave. Why? I have absolutely no idea at all. We have some spending commitments up to the end of 2020. Beyond that, nothing. We also, of course, have a stake in many parts of the European Union. And I think it's summed up today to me rather beautifully by a cartoon by Bob in the Sunday Telegraph. And it shows Mrs Thatcher walking out of an EU building with a big bag full of cash. And it shows Theresa May trying to get into an EU building with an even bigger bag of cash. And that kind of sums up where we are to me. I think the Prime Minister is probably on the verge of making a pretty gargantuan financial offer to the European Union in return for no promises whatsoever. Your messages flooding in. Martin in Rotherhithe says 60 billion. Is that all? They're also telling us what to do with the Northern Irish border. Their arrogance is beyond belief. Tell them to keep their big noses out of Northern Ireland. Nigel, if the EU will not agree to a free trade agreement, then the EU must be prepared to pay for a hard border. That would not be in the interests of the Irish people, and they'd soon come knocking on Barnier's door, says David. And Alistair Campbell always excites comment. Campbell is a press officer who's never been elected to anything. Why do you keep getting him on? Who cares what he thinks? Well, yeah, but Mr Barnier's not elected, and Mr Tusk's not elected, and Mr Juncker's not elected. None of the people who are making demands of us are elected. They're all appointees in Brussels. And I also think, when we listen to Alistair Campbell, we're also hearing what Tony Blair, and actually many of the Blairites in the Labour Party, still genuinely think. Let's go to Lowestoft, to June. Good morning, June.
Good morning, Nigel. Good morning.
So, should we do what Mr Tusk and the others are asking us to do?
No, I wouldn't have given him a cent. But there you go. Not a dime, not a euro, whatever they want. No, but
so you're a hardliner, June. You're a hard Brexiter. I mean, weren't you listening, June, to Alistair Campbell, who told us that disaster will come?
Well, he was saying that he has done some audiences. So, Mr. Campbell, you're obviously still listening. Mr. Campbell, I would love you to come to visit the fishing industry or chicken factories or some factories, or get out of the M25, come out of London and come and visit coastal communities. I never hear you or Mr Corbyn or any of these guys talking about industry. You never hear it. They never pay visits. So, Mr Campbell, please could you come to the east coast of England and have a little chat with myself and my fishermen?
Right. Well, that's a pretty open offer, isn't it? So come on, Alistair.
Yes,
June, and you'll give him a nice cup of tea, won't you, when he's there, and treat him nicely.
And I'll give him a nice piece of fish.
And a nice piece of fish.
If I'm allowed to catch any.
Well, there is a problem with European quotas, I know.
Can I just plug one little thing? Tuesday, MEPs are voting for pulse fishing. It has to stop.
I know.
It's illegal in China. It's illegal in the EU. The Dutch have been pulsing away our waters. We're finished on the East Coast, all the way down to Ramsgate. They're pulsed us out. They killed the fish. They killed the creatures. They killed the ocean.
June, June, let me just explain to the wider audience what June's talking about. She's talking about a relatively new fishing technique which is being used by, I think, about 60 Dutch fishing boats, and it's called pulse fishing. And what it means is they put an electric shock down to the bottom of the seabed to take the fish in the nets. The problem with it is that it's killing an awful lot of small species. It's killing a lot of fish that are not being landed and sold in market. I think it is, June, an environmental disaster that is going on in the North Sea, and it's all allowed by the European Commission, and much of it is happening in what should be British territorial waters, and I'm very angry about it. June, one quick question on this point, because it does matter. What does Michael Gove have to say to you about pulse fishing and the British position?
I saw George Eustace last week with my MP, and George Eustace is not happy about it at all. I had a meeting in London with lots of different stakeholders in the industry, mainly science, can I just let the public know there is no science. This country has done no science. It's been a scientific thing that's been done by the Dutch only for 10 years. It's not been looked at. There's 112 pulse trawlers. 10 of those are flagships, which that means that we own them, but the Dutch have them.
Yep.
While I was at the meeting last week in London with these various bodies, CFAS, etc., DEFRA, the French were there. And the French are behind us, Nigel. There was a young lady, apparently they've broken the law. That should never have happened, and a lot of money has gone into it. So I think if any of MPs are listening, and they obviously will, because they learn a lot from you, Nigel, if any MPs are listening, Tuesday you're voting.
Okay,
I hope
June.
you vote against.
June, you've made a big pitch there, and it wasn't on topic, but it's a fascinating subject, and I know that when it comes to the environment and what's being done to it, people genuinely do care about this subject. And June, thank you. And we will, within the next few weeks, do a fishing special, because I went out on a trawler from Ramsgate a few weeks ago just to see exactly how European quotas are working, and I watched the skipper and his son running their own under 10-metre boat, and I watched them throwing back into the sea scores of thornback rays that they caught, some of which will have lived, an awful lot of which will actually have died. And we will do a special phone-in on that, and I promise June in Lowestoft we will bring this question of pulse fishing into the equation as well. June, I thank you. Mark is calling from Sevenoaks. Mark, good morning.
Good morning. My idea is that I think that the negotiation should be more of a process of exploring greater flexibility in our relationship with the EU, rather than looking for something more sudden. I think this could help progress the negotiations. At the moment, anyway, the whole of the British state is not in the EU. The Isle of Man is in this free trade area. I think the Channel Islands are not in that even.
No.
So we could start by talking about adjusting these borders. If we're not moving all the regions out at once, that gets round some of the initial problems like Northern Ireland, and it provides places for people to live who are EU citizens here.
But are you suggesting, Mark, that the United Kingdom leaves the EU but Northern Ireland stays in for a further period?
I am suggesting that that it's not considered to be something that all happens at once necessarily. We can be more experimental and scientific about it. We don't have to move all the regions out at once.
I think we do, Mark. I think we do. I mean, we did vote as a United Kingdom, didn't we?
That's true, but there's also the possibility of regions raising that they want to devolve things. And one of the things that we have to remember is that we review our political decisions in a general election every 5 years, and in 2021 it'll be 5 years since the EU referendum, so it'll be hard to argue it would be undemocratic to review that decision then.
Well, actually, Mark, the truth of it is, by 2021, we should have left the European Union, its single market, taken back control of our borders, and it should be an issue of history. The problem is, Mark, my feeling is, the way this government have dragged their heels, that actually, by the time the next general election comes along, we'll still be more in the EU than out of it. We'll be out, I suspect, in name only. Mark, they're suggesting that different parts of the UK could leave the EU at different speeds. That would not be acceptable. Not acceptable, I think, to most of us. I wonder whether the European Union would accept it. After all, they don't want Catalonia to have their own voice, do they? You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show. Well, my debate with Alistair Campbell seems to have stirred a few of you up on Facebook. Frank says, Campbell's contempt of the voting public is beyond belief. Terry says, I'm pleased you allowed Campbell to ramble on. I'm now more convinced than ever that leaving the EU was the right decision, and the sooner the better. And Russell on Facebook says, we need positivity. Britain will do fine outside the EU. We will continue doing great trade, create jobs, and have more cash to build upon an already great, strong, prosperous nation. The more you realise it, the more it will happen. Just like anything. If if you fill yourself with negativity, you end up failing. And I do think, Russell, there's a lot of truth in that. But so much of a narrative around this debate is negative. And we're getting it from many members of Parliament. We're getting it from many of the bosses of the big businesses. Goldman Sachs repeatedly doing this stuff. Even this week, their chief executive calling for a second referendum. But David Davis and Mrs May are in a fix. They've been given an ultimatum. They've got a fortnight to meet the demands of our unelected lords and masters in Brussels, or we will not be able to talk about trade. And Kevin from Bermondsey, by text, says, shouldn't Theresa May be giving them an ultimatum? Do you know what, Kevin? I think we've reached that point, because what we saw at the Florence speech was Mrs May basically making concessions. Mrs May appeasing the European Union, thinking in return they'd be reasonable. David Davis repeatedly asking for them to be reasonable. And I'm afraid my view is that if you appease bullies, you get nowhere. You've got to stand up for yourself. That's what I think. I wonder what Philip in Windsor thinks this morning. Hello.
Morning, Nigel. The specifics of the Irish border I'd just like to sort of pick up on. I find it slightly disingenuous of the Irish government, and Alistair Campbell come to that, to raise the implicit threat of Good Friday collapsing as a result of Brexit. I mean, there's always going to be a political disagreement in the island of Ireland, but it will be driven by economic concerns, and I reckon the Irish government have got much more to worry about than the politics of the border than the economics of the border.
Well, what happens, Philip, in Brussels, and the Good Friday Agreement, something, of course, a process that John Major began and that Tony Blair finished, and with a huge amount of give and take, to get that onto the blocks. What happened was, even though it was the Americans, actually, it was Senator Mitchell, if you remember, that acted as the broker between the two sides. The European Union managed to get the name of their organisation written into the Good Friday Agreement, and they kind of claim in Brussels that had it not been for the European Commission, there wouldn't have been a peace deal in Ireland. That's what it's about.
Yeah, I spent a year of my life trudging up and down that particular border, and you can make it as hard as you like, it's still going to be porous.
It's about 350 miles long, isn't it, Philip? Is that right?
I couldn't tell you precisely how long it is, but it's long enough.
Right, okay. Yeah, and much of it's rural. I mean, as I say, I tried to argue this with Campbell earlier. We've had, a common travel area since 1921. Ireland itself is not part of Schengen, which I think makes things a bit easier. But there is this question of goods, of tariffs, moving across the border, which is why actually the solution to this is for us to have a simple free trade deal with the EU. Then I think, Philip, it's a non-issue.
I think you're right. I mean, the amount of smuggling that used to go on down there, and probably still does, was phenomenal. It wasn't just weapons; it was eggs, diesel, cattle, everything. It was, and
of course now with the South being in the euro, and with the North being with sterling, you're going to get goods moving back and forth, aren't you? To take advantage of price differentials.
Of course you are, and that's why I say it's the economic dimension which worries the Irish government. The implicit threat of politics is, I find, disingenuous.
Yeah, so do I, Philip. And all the people, and I know lots of people in the Northern Irish unionist community, and all of them want to compromise in any way they can. Nobody wants to threaten, nobody responsible wants to threaten the Good Friday Agreement, the peace that's been achieved. Philip, I thank you for your call, and Philip saying, frankly, this is being hammed up as an issue when really there are quite practical ways of dealing with it. Carol is calling from Kent. Good morning, Carol.
Good morning, Nigel.
So what does Mrs May do?
Well, yes, we agree. Of course we agree. That taking into consideration that other European countries don't play cricket according to rules, so we agree. We don't pay it, but we agree nicely.
Right.
Smile. Probably we're going to be very ashamed of me. I'm very sorry, but I just think that we've paid not the government, but we as taxpayers have paid already an awful lot into the EU.
Well, we've paid a huge amount into the EU, of course we have. But so you're suggesting, Carol, that we go in and say, yeah, OK, fine, we'll pay you, and then when it comes to it, 6 months, a year, 2 years down the road, we just knock them, do we?
That's right.
Okay, that's an interesting tactic from Carol there. And my last caller on this subject is Tony in Fareham. What do you think, Tony? And not just Theresa May. I feel a bit sorry for David Davis, because he kind of is piggy in the middle, isn't he? He's the one arguing for reason, and now they're laughing at him.
Well, I think you're right, and good morning, Nigel.
Good morning.
I think they're just constantly, it's a smoke and mirrors game they're playing at the moment. They're just trying to... 1 week it's free movement of people. Next week it's the rights of EU citizens and vice versa. And this week it's the 60 billion euros. Well, my only question on this is, please can you add up all our assets and take that away from the 60 billion?
Well, that's interesting, Tony. So one of the arguments I've been making is that we've got a 9 billion investment in the European Investment Bank, and so we should be able to get that investment out. Maybe not immediately, but we should be able to get that out. Alexander Stubb, one of the vice presidents of the EIB, has said the UK will get its money back, but it'll take until 2054. I mean, whichever way you look at this, they're being completely unreasonable. And I wonder, Tony, whether what we ought to do is go to Juncker and say, look, we know you've got a huge wine cellar that is owned by the European Commission. Presumably, as we pay 16% of the bill for the whole club, we can have 16% of your wine cellar. I wonder what he'd say.
Well, I mean, I think that, the thing that the public doesn't realise is that they're charging us for projects. They're going to be charging us for projects, EU projects, that have not yet been financed or budgeted for.
Yes.
And that's where my big problem is, because literally they're holding us to ransom for the poorer countries of the EU, bless them, who cannot afford these projects. And then richer countries like France and Germany are going to be putting their hands in their pockets to subsidise our lack of...
Should Mrs. Tony,
money.
I'm going to ask you final question, last word on this subject. Should Theresa May be prepared to pay 53 billion sterling for us to leave the European Union?
Definitely not.
Definitely not, says Tony in Fareham, and definitely not, say I. It is outrageous. Time we started putting out a few demands and not being dictated to by everybody in